There are an estimated 3 to 4 million Zimbabweans living in the diaspora, all actively involved in the economy through sending money, goods and services to their families back home. But it's been widely acknowledged that they do have a more prominent role to play in the economy and in economic recovery. But how do they do that? The chairperson of a consortium of Zimbabweans abroad who are actively involved and have recently sealed a transaction in the rail sector is one of my guests. I'm speaking to him alongside an economic analyst who will be sharing his views on how to make the most of Zimbabwe's diaspora. This is the Business Agenda. We'll be getting underway shortly. This is the Business Agenda with me, Farai Mwakutuya, and tonight my guests are the Executive Chairman of the Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group, Mr. Donovan Chimhandamba, alongside an economic analyst, Vince Musewe. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming through to the program. Great to have you here.
Awesome. Thank you. Great to be here.
As mentioned, we're obviously looking at the role of the diaspora in economic recovery. Let me begin with you, Donovan. We know that the diaspora is already playing an active role in terms of remittances, formally and informally. We keep hearing that the diaspora is, the next frontier, has potential to help Zimbabwe in terms of its economic recovery. What could be done that is not being done now? What could this diaspora deliver that it isn't already?
Well, I think for starters, I think what we need to realize and understand is that the diasporans have been the largest community bringing in cash into Zimbabwe. And I think in 2016, the Zimbabwean government recognized that, and they put together the bill called the Zimbabwe National Diaspora Policy. I think it came at the back of the realization that I think at that time, just over $1 billion was coming through formal channels, and it's estimated about another $3 billion through informal channels. Now, the key thing in terms of that money, it was largely going into consumption-related activities to support our families here. And the monies don't come necessarily with $1 million a person, sending money $1 million, but it comes in small tranches like $100, $50, $1,000 to buy it and pay school fees. Now, what's been happening over the years and globally, I mean, there's almost 4 to 5 million, depending on which person you speak to, but first-generation diasporans is about 4 to 5 million Zimbabweans living outside Zimbabwe. And all of those have some, there's this natural inherent patriotic feeling that we want to do something back at home. But also that's been compounded by, economic issues or situations that are happening out there. I mean, all the other economies are not necessarily as performing as they were in the past. And many Zimbabweans are trying to find ways to repatriate or to move themselves back into Zimbabwe. So there's a growing recognition that probably this is the right time for us as Zimbabweans to go back and take a position, purely because the opportunity exists in Zimbabwe right now. Anything you think of, is an opportunity. Everything is coming from almost a very low base. So in terms of what could be done, I mean, the national diaspora policy ended up in a couple of incentives associated with diaspora investments, tax holidays, repatriation of dividends. If you are to import any capital goods or equipment, waiver of certain import duties around that. And those things are good, because why should they only be going to foreign companies when, not to us diasporans? So there's a lot of around that, I think the marketing around that. And then obviously, naturally, diaspora versus government, there's been a history of not being aligned in terms of interest. So the instruments or the actions that the government or Zimbabwe can do in a way is to try and, de-link whatever they're proposing for diasporans with necessarily the political issues that are happening in Zimbabwe. Because once you do that, then people take a political side, and so there's a lot of things that could be done. Also, from DIDG perspective, what we needed to do was everyone wants to invest, but no one knows how. So we had to create a structured platform that allows for people to buy, almost unitized shares, very low amounts of money, and contribute, and almost through a crowdfunding model. So you have collective investment schemes that allow people to buy in small units. Obviously, you put that with fund managers and companies that have a track record because you're managing people's money, and that once you have that, the diaspora capital is the first equity check that Zimbabwe needs to convince the rest of the world that Zimbabwe is indeed going to be fixing its own country.
Vince, having lived in the diaspora itself and hearing what Donovan is saying here, I just want to ask the issue of capacity. Yes, Zimbabweans have an opportunity to play a part, but do they have the financial muscle to be able to do that? If, for instance, they are able to put away $1,200 per month, how would they get involved?
Yeah. Okay, let's be very clear. When we say diaspora, it's not a broad church of common needs and common characteristics. You have what I call clusters, right? You have those diasporans who run businesses who've been very successful, who have got organizations, okay? And you then have diasporans who are working, professionals who are very in influential positions, and then you have the rest of the crew, basically people who are just working, and for me, they don't have fundamental value to add when it comes to money. I mean, they're struggling. They survive. I mean, life is not easy out there. Let's not assume that it's all rosy. It's quite tough for a lot of them. So the last thing they have is to actually send money to invest at home. It's about survival. As you were saying, most of the money is just for survival. So let us then look at the various clusters and say, okay, those individuals, for example, who have run successful companies offshore are our first cream. Those are the people we want to come home because they've got a footprint out of the country. They obviously got serious networks, business networks. They run viable businesses out of the country. And it's an issue of them bringing existing businesses into the country. It's not startups. It's not risky. It's not new projects. So that's the cream that we want. We then have individuals, obviously professionals who've got access to capital, who've got an emotional attachment to Zimbabwe, who want to come home and make a difference. I mean, that will probably, include the DIDG, some of your people there. And the issue is then we need to make sure that they come home as soon as possible. But when they arrive here, we need to give them a soft landing kind of mechanism. In other words, for example, they can bring in as much as they want back into the country. There's no duties. They can even have a window period where they think they should, put a foot in and see if they want to stay or not. We should give them that kind of comfort so that they can come back. And then what we then have to do is to marry them with the local. But there is a fundamental problem in that the local financial structure is a commercial banking structure. Whereas the money that is going to develop Zimbabwe must be long-term private equity money. So it's a different structure of money that we are actually expecting. And it might not necessarily match with the paradigm of the banking. One thing I found, for example, here, the paradigm of banking is very short-term, very red tape, very analytic, very risk-averse. And it's difficult to get deals done. Whereas when you bring private equity, they are more risk averse. They actually look at better opportunity. So I don't think we necessarily have to merge. The idea is actually let's create islands of excellence where we get diasporans even coming to establish their own banks here, that they can fund new projects because they've got a different paradigm. And to me, that is what we have to look at.
Very quickly, before we go to a break, Donovan, let me ask you this. Patriotism is one thing, emotional attachment is another thing, but I suppose at the end of the day, every investor wants a return, and you want to go into a market where you are assured of some stability, of some consistency. And those places where people in the diaspora are doing business provide that. What makes Zimbabwe an alternative? What makes it an option?
So what we've seen, I mean, for us, for starters, we chose infrastructure strategically. And the reason for infrastructure is that it's not volatile, or it's not affected by the volatility of politics. People buy water regardless of who's in power. So we chose infrastructure as a defensive asset, as opposed to going to FMCG and all those things that that can change with change in political dynamics. The second thing is that we're not a social movement. We're definitely looking for returns. And I run a private equity fund. We've been doing investments across Africa. And when we look at all the other geographies or countries, we see in Zimbabwe as the next frontier. So it's not because we love Zimbabwe only. Loving Zimbabwe helps us to sell the story to the other banks who are not, or foreigners who are not Zimbabweans. But what we're saying is that when you look at South Africa, there's no visibility in terms of public works programs. There's no big projects that are going to drive construction. We're seeing a huge hemorrhage in the mining industry, a lot of people losing jobs. And some of the issues you're having in South Africa are starting to pop up because there's a shrinking pie, and people are asking, so where's the next hope? And then people start talking about land. So in our case, Zimbabwe is at a low base. I actually don't understand. I don't believe that even a target of 4 or 5% growth for the next 5 years I think we should be targeting for even a much more aggressive number, considering the base where we're coming from. So in the nature of the industries we operate in, we think there's a low base, and there's an opportunity to come in and take a prime position right now and have high returns. There will come a time when you have those investors who like steady environments, and the returns will be commensurate to the amount of risk you're taking as well.
Indeed, hold that thought. This is the Business Agenda. We're going to take a short break, come back and continue this discussion, so don't go away. Welcome back. This is the Business Agenda. Let me put it to you, gentlemen, and say this. A lot of people will think that to get a foot in the door, to be able to get access to some of these projects, to these investment opportunities, one has to be close to the ruling elite, to have political connections. Is that indeed true? I'll begin with you, Donovan, because you are, living proof.
No, we get asked that question every day because not many people believe you can just get NRZ without some connections. Mm-hmm. I think, in speaking to our transaction specifically, we have no political connections to that effect. I think when we started, everyone kept on suspecting that it might be the other political faction, and probably that benefited our transaction to a large extent because everyone just suspected maybe so-and-so is involved. Mm-hmm. And only later on they realized that this is a group of Zimbabweans and we've put together a technical proposal that adds very important selling points that are not related to politics. If you were to take that transaction anywhere in the world and compare it with what some of the offers that we saw from the Chinese, from the British, and we believe that we had a strong case, we had a strong proposition to the deal. But in our case, we work with people who are in the office. If you're working in some sort of like a privatization or a public privatization, private partnership, you have to work with the people in the office. Unfortunately, people then start thinking that you are, if the minister in that office at that time, people start saying, maybe there's something with the minister. But we work with the people who are in government, and we are here to try and make it work.
Vince, that is a sentiment, the fact that, people think they are political connections, but also once you start doing business with a state enterprise or ministry, for instance, then come issues of efficiency, professionalism, commercial outlook. Yeah. Do you think that government at this stage is at that position where they're happy to say, let's allow business to thrive, let's make commercially viable decisions?
Well, I think the president has been very clear on his attitude, whether the infrastructure or the institutional memory has shifted towards what the president is saying is another issue. But let's not be naive here. We are coming from a period of 37 years of patronage, we had serious problems even giving a deal to government because they'd steal it. Mm-hmm. They'll say no, and then the next day it's been implemented. And then that would mean that you have to have a minister for your deal to be protected. That was the environment that we're coming from. And no matter which country you go, you need to appreciate the politics. It's not that they are you're paying them off or whatever. But you can't do business without the political side. Let's not be naive. That is the state of affairs in Africa. Mm-hmm. And we have to embrace that, not be corrupt, right? Mm-hmm. But appreciate that there are vested political interests in anything that you do, and they're competing interests, right? And that's the nature of the beast, right? As long as, number one, it does not take away investors in the sense of transaction costs, and there's no corruption payoffs and whatever, you have to convince the Minister of Transport that putting a dual highway in this area is the right thing to do, and do the appropriate research. At the end of the day, he has to sign it off. So we have to engage them whether we like it or not.
Donovan, you mentioned earlier that they're working with people in the office, working with people on the ground. Have you come across the sentiment where Zimbabweans who've remained here, who haven't gone into the diaspora, feel antagonistic perhaps towards you because you went out there?
Not at all. I keep on hearing the same questions and mumblings, but I haven't experienced that. Mm-hmm. Just to touch on Vince's point, is that I think the key issue when people talk about politicians being involved, I think underlying question they're trying to ask is about a corrupt relationship somewhere, but then you have to work with the minister because you can't expect to be, implementing a national railways project without the minister's involvement. Now, so I think what we need to understand is, when that happens, it should not be misconstrued to be some form of corrupt relationship that's happening. In terms of Zimbabweans in general, I think what we are actually finding is that there are people desperate to get things going, and people are tired. People are saying, I mean, when you look at the NRZ, we were quite shocked by the NRZ management team. You know, we're coming from outside, you know, we have this view. We left 16, 18 years ago. We have this view saying, these guys, we will show them how to run railways. They don't know how to, you know, that arrogant view that comes from the foreigners sometimes. But then when we start doing the due diligence and engaging, you actually realize, hang on, you actually have people with the capabilities. What might not be there is the culture of excellence, the culture of, you know, the work ethic, because people had to find other means to survive if you're not being paid a salary. So as things start turning around, what we think as diasporans will bring is the ability to actually focus on, you know, if job starts at 8 and finishes at 5, I mean, you put in you're all into that, not busy trading, you know, cash somewhere or doing some transaction outside. Mm-hmm. But we find in the Zimbabweans, especially in these entities, they're raring to go. The expectations are a little bit too much sometimes in terms of when they expect things to start turning. Uh-huh. And we've seen transactions that take quite, you know, there are similar transactions like this that have not even gotten to any of signing of the first agreement that we signed or even put in an interim solution.
Talking about that, perhaps is an opportunity then for you to appraise us in terms of where are we with this transaction? So you know, what was key? In terms of the transaction, we, you know, after the tender, we had to do the due diligence. Now, the due diligence is not, you know, everyone says, but we are now doing a due diligence after you won the tender. Yeah. So, but what we're doing there is we were given numbers based on NRZ's own information. And the due diligence that was done there was a very high-level one. Now, what we're doing there is called the validation of certain key assumptions in the business model. We needed to sit down with each and every client, a customer, understand their commodities, the distance they move, the payment structures, where do they sit with go through the rail network and actually understand where is it damaged. And then out of that technical, you know, assessment, you'll be able to prioritize. Now you know where your volumes are going to be moving from, so you know exactly which corridor to start with, because you don't want to start with the yards that are not moving there. So the due diligence was there for us to come back and inform the qualified financial model with those. Now, once you have that, then you can go back to the banks with the concession agreement that we've negotiated in the JV agreements. Then we can go back to the banks and reprice and say, now, because, you know, pricing is all about allocating risk. So if people are not clear who's taking what risk, the banks can't price it, and, you know, that means it just gets more and more expensive. Mm-hmm. So we just completed that a month ago, and we've now started the whole process now of re-engaging the banks, where the term sheets will start coming back based on the new financial model that we have. And I must say that financial model is actually quite impressive compared to what we went in the bid with, because we thought there's no volumes. In fact, we were advocating for a statutory instrument to move from road to
rail. And now we say, no. We actually,
we don't need that.
We will grow with the volumes, because, you know, you can only move so fast in terms of, you know, doing the rehabilitation works. So we are there now, and over the next 4 months, 3-4 months, the focus will be on achieving, firstly, obviously, the equity close. We need to appraise Cabinet and Ministry of Finance in terms of the new funding terms and structures. Then we chase the equity close. And what we want to do around that is move away from the conventional project finance structures where you have to wait for everything to tick off the box. We need to start, if we do our equity close, we need to start rolling out programs based on that equity check. Because the banks always fund after the equity holders have put in their money. So by the end of the year, we expect to be somewhere there. And then first quarter, second quarter, we should have the debt financial close as well.
Okay, we need to take another short break. When we come back, we'll now look at some of the key steps, I think, what needs to be done to get mobilize more investors, and particularly diaspora investors, into Zimbabwe, how that process can be eased, how we can make it better and more conducive. This is the Business Agenda. Do stay with us. Welcome back. The Business Agenda does continue. My guests in the studio tonight, Donovan Chimhandamba is the Executive Director of the Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group, alongside Vince Musewe, who's an economic analyst. Vince, very quickly, in your view, we know that sentiment towards, and I certainly, when I've spoken to you outside of this platform, you've said sentiment towards Zimbabwe is changing from the investment community. How can we get more investors, and particularly diaspora investors, coming in, having more success stories like DIDG participating in rebuilding Zimbabwe?
Well, I think the first thing, we're doing the right thing to actually showcase what is happening, the others that are coming in, because it tends to encourage other people to actually come into the country. But we need to aggressively market the country. I think the president has been going on a general vision terms. We now need to take projects outside, particular projects, whether it's a roads project, whether it's a water project, the infrastructure projects that are key. We actually need to showcase these projects to, and as opposed to waiting for people to come to Zimbabwe, we as Zimbabweans now need to go and seek investors out of the country with valid projects.
Donovan, Zimbabwe is still a country under U.S. sanctions, still uncertainty. We've just come out of an election where, it had to go to the courts. Are those real issues impacting potential investors that you are speaking to who are putting money into your fund?
Well, I think considering that all the bankers or funders behind us, when we tendered for this bid, this was in June 2017. It was 2018, sorry. And there was, still the President Mugabe's administration. So we had already factored with the banks a lot of issues around how do we structure, our investment vehicles. For example, the borrower of reference is a vehicle that will sit in South Africa and probably Mauritius for dollar accounts. Mm-hmm. And we have wrapped around those vehicles with a credit enhancement from ECIC and other insurance companies. So that people are taking the sovereign risk they're taking is no longer Zimbabwe, it's South African or Mauritian, mm-hmm. and those things. So we had almost come to a point where we had priced or put in mitigation strategies around that. Now, fortunately for us, and people think we had a crystal ball somewhere because the timing couldn't have been better, mm-hmm. And Zimbabwe then started, and then there was a new regime. And there was more emphasis on the economy and jobs. And that helped because all the bureaucratic institutions we needed to deal with, which, the international funders always think that it is the same administration that goes and floats its own, flouts its own rules and regulations. So we definitely think there's an increase in sentiment. Mm-hmm. And partly there are no other projects around the region. Mm-hmm. There are no other countries that are showing any signs of opportunities. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge opportunity for Zimbabwe here to take advantage of and actually crowd in all these investors who are looking for a place. Very interestingly, before we came on air, you spoke about the fact that Zimbabweans here are actually also part of this consortium. Is there an opportunity there as well, and how? No, for sure. For sure. When we started, the vehicle is anchored by diasporans outside Zimbabwe. But when we started, we had this view of, Zimbabweans, they can't invest because they have RTGS or bond notes. But then as we started working on the transaction, we realized we've got local costs. Now we're busy taking foreign borrowings to fund paying a salary here. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make sense. So there is a huge, in our structure, we've got about 50% being Zimbabweans in South Africa, and then about 20% are Zimbabweans living here in Zimbabwe. And then the balance is amongst the Zimbabweans in USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Namibia, and Botswana. So there's a definite need to balance that. Even at an institutional funding level, we cannot go and take the entire 400 million to be able to, so that we can pay for something that is locally produced. We have to balance our FDI with our direct investment from the locals or the local banks. So there's definitely, we can't have one or the other without, you need to balance both. Zimbabwe, yeah. Vince, we've heard obviously DIDG looking specifically at infrastructure. Where are the other opportunities?
Well, there's significant opportunities in agriculture, even on the infrastructure level. We need to have serious irrigation systems put into place in solar farms, new energy sources in the agricultural side. There's significant opportunities on the renewable energy, as I said. Also on the mining sector, particularly the small scale, we need to modernize to ensure that that sector becomes more formal. Right now it's really tough for those guys. So we need to formalize that because they're going to produce more gold going forward. There's also opportunities in health. It's the health services in Zimbabwe. We've got so many doctors and nurses in the UK, for example, who have serious experience that they can bring into the country. There's opportunities in education where we're looking at electronic education as opposed to the old model of education. So if you look in the entirety, as he's quite right, in the entirety of the whole economy, it's the significant niche, but the challenge is that what we have to do as a country now, we must package those things and present them. Packaging, getting the information together, so, and using the structures that you're talking about. As I was saying, the banking sector here is not as creative as private equity. So we actually need to have conversations about how do we structure, I always say that we actually need people right at the top in the president's office looking at all these mega deals, whether they've been structured correctly to the benefit of Zimbabweans. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the time. There's actually a scramble for Zimbabwe, whether you want to believe it or not. That's what I believe.
How easy is it to get people on the same page as you've done with your consortium, people who have, I suppose, that long-term view, and people who are willing to, seed their money and say, look, we are entrusting our vision to Donovan?
I think Vince started off explaining that you've got, the diaspora is not one monolithic, grouping of people. Mm-hmm. There are clusters of people. There are those who are entrepreneurial, running businesses that are successful, and then there are those who are in well-paid jobs, who are doing well in terms of, normal jobs. And then you have, a lot of guys working in restaurants, and so when you're targeting those people, the expectation is different. Mm-hmm. So what you'll probably find from driving a project, once there's a package project, you look at our entire team, it's people who have been working in, the deal-making environment, or raising capital, running operations. So and you can, if you talk to those people with their businesses and stuff, and they're willing to take that risk, that's your starting point. Yeah. The guys who are employed in good jobs, it's more a source of skills that you need to repatriate to Zimbabwe. They might come and crowdfund, and each one puts $1,000, but what they bring is the technical capacity and skills. So you need to, almost like send them, be able to bring them, not to repatriate Zimbabweans and from diaspora, and then Zimbabweans locally here are sitting on the sidelines. But you need to infuse that so that you can start changing the culture and the work ethic locally, and the mindset in terms of how we do deals. I mean, in our structure, even the local banks, we've done the structures offshore and put all the structures and explain why this is being done in this way. And the banks, they will come and participate in an arranged structure, as you arrange it. But if local banks are just sitting together alone in the room,
then they're not getting that exposure, indeed.
So the structure and the result might be much more different to what you do when you bring in international investors.
Gentlemen, we must end this discussion here, only because we're out of time, but I want to thank you both for coming through, taking your time and sharing your insights. Thank you so much. Donovan Chimhandamba, Executive Director of Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group. Vince Musewe, Economic Analyst who wears his heart on his sleeve. As always, my name is Farai Mwakutuya. You've been watching The Business Agenda. I do thank you for tuning in and choosing us. Please engage with us on our social media platforms. We'll continue these discussions, give you bonus footage and other clips that you may not have seen on this program. So be sure to follow us and like us on those platforms. It is The Business Agenda.